So welcome. This is one of our Smart Town series. It's a collaboration throughout the community here. It's one of the last ones we'll be holding here at the museum in 2020, but we're already looking forward to 2021. Some virtual presentations for you throughout those abysmal January, February cold months where it's dragging on a bit. Without any further ado, I am actually going to hand it off to Patrick McKay. He is the museum manager here, and he's going to introduce our special guest for the evening. So take it away, Pat.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for sharing your evening with us, especially on Veterans Day. This is a chance for us each year to really look at the local impact that the veterans have had in our community. And it's just a chance for us to step back and take a breath and say thank you to all those who have served, you know, from the Black Hawk War and the Revolutionary War and ended up in the Rochester area, to those veterans who live in our community today. We just want to say thank you for the sacrifice, for your family, and for all those who have supported you and for you supporting us. And we just take that very seriously, and it's an honor to be able to celebrate the veterans. And each year on Veterans Day, we take that very seriously, that we would always do a program. And we have met some remarkable personalities over the course of years that we've done these programs. So thanks for sharing your evening with us tonight. You know, as a local history museum, we're really fortunate to work with lots of members in our community tonight. We have Frank Cardimen. Frank is a longtime resident of the Rochester Hills community. For many years, he was a fundraiser here at the museum. And I know a couple of the things that we can point to specifically with Frank is our schoolhouse. The Stony Creek Schoolhouse 10 years ago was donated to us by the Rochester Community Schools through a really mutual, collaborative, friendly transaction, so we could make sure that that building was well taken care of. Frank not only helped with that transaction, but then to raise the money that was necessary, not only to put money into the building immediately, but to put money in the bank so we have an endowment to operate that building. So he was a significant part of that. And then all the fundraising. It was an $800,000 project to build a calf barn, and Frank was right there on every step of the way. So he's been a strong partner with the museum, and we really appreciate what our local community does for us. Over the years, Frank has done a number of programs here at the museum. He's done one on Winston Churchill. He's done one on the cracking of the Enigma Code, the one on spies and deception in World War II. For 42 years, he's been a special instructor at Oak University, and tonight he's going to share the program on Pearl Harbor and the Battle of Midway. So, Frank, I'm turning it back over to you. I think Kathy's helping you get logged in, and let's sit back and enjoy.
You can talk if you want.
All set?
Yep. All right, good evening, everybody. We're going to share the screen here. We'll share it. We'll go from the beginning. All right, you're all set.
Very good. Thank you, Kathy and Pat, for the introduction. My name is Frank Cardimen, and I am very, very pleased to be with everyone tonight. Today is a very special day. It's a Remembrance Day. It's Veterans Day, remembering all of those who have served and all of those who are serving today. And so for this moment, we recognize them and say thank you. Tonight, we're going to be doing some other remembrance. And within the next 26 days, it will be a very special day. The attack on Pearl Harbor 79 years ago. 26 days to be Pearl Harbor. What I'd like to do tonight is take you through the first 6 to 7 months following Pearl Harbor. Share with you the Battle of Pearl Harbor, the American response by by Doolittle, the response to Coral Sea, and then this major Battle of Midway. So let's get started. Prior to Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, Japan wanted to expand. The new partners and the new leadership in Japan had visions of being the leaders of the Southeast Pacific and wanted to expand. And because they are an island, they didn't have very many resources. So in order to take advantage of their great military strength and numbers of military people, they had to get resources, oil, food, etc. As an island nation, they didn't have that. This goes back to 1931, when Japan invaded Manchuria. They became entrenched there, but it wasn't then until 1937 where they began what was now called, or what is called, Second Sino-Japanese War begins, and they invaded China. They were there for 3 years, and then Japan invaded French Indochina. And they wanted to embargo all the imports to China. They wanted to lock down China so that they could take over China, but they had to bring China to its knees. China was so big. In 1940, the US establishes an embargo on all oil exports to Japan. The US and many countries in the world began to see what Japan was trying to do, and the US said, Japan, we can't allow you to do that to Southeast Asia, particularly since we are the American protectorate of the Philippines. In 1940, Japan only has 2 years left of some oil, and they needed to seize more raw materials from the Dutch East Indies. In 1940, the same year, Japan considers a military takeover of the Philippines, but categorically said no, because if they did that, they knew there would be an American response. In 41, Japan and the US negotiates to try and avoid war. In early 1941, Japanese planning to attack Pearl Harbor as an attack to give Japan years of freedom from America. And I'll share that point with you in a few minutes. The next day, by the way, December 8th, Japan, after bombing Pearl Harbor on the 7th, invades the Philippines and takes it over. That's the sequence up to Pearl Harbor. Little summary. In 38, 1 million Japanese troops are in China. By 41, they have 2 million troops. They're convinced that's not enough. And out of fear, they adopt this concept called the 3-all campaign, kill all, burn all, destroy all. And you've probably heard of the Nanking massacres. That was part of it. But Japan still didn't feel like it had enough soldiers. As a postscript of the war, in 45, over 4 million Chinese people had died. 60 million had been displaced as a result of the Japanese. Many Chinese cities lay in ruin. Well, okay. The US did respond to this aggression of wanting to expand. So the US demanded that Japan withdraw from China and Indochina, and they said no. Japan thought that attacking the US would provide them an easy win and a territory, abundant land and resources to rule. The US applied an oil embargo in Japan, and that really hurt the Japanese to the point where something had to be done. While negotiating in Washington, D.C., during the 6th and 7th, Japan was embarking on Pearl Harbor, invading and attacking the island. The negotiators never translated the communications coming from Japan that said, we are no longer going to negotiate, we're at war, which meant that the US was attacked without any knowledge. Here's what the Imperial Japanese expansion looked like from 37 to 41. The dark brown is the territory under Japanese control, and you can see the parts of it in Manchuria and in China and down in Indochina. And you can see how close the Philippine Islands are. And those were protected by the US. So Japan said, no, we're not going to do that. We'll go to Hawaii first, then we'll come back and get the Philippines, which is what they did. The Pacific Ocean is large. Between China and the US, you have a few atolls and a few islands in there. And Midway is almost halfway. Excuse me, Midway and Oahu and Pearl Harbor are about halfway. That's where the American naval fleet was, in Pearl Harbor. If Pearl Harbor is destroyed, or the naval force is destroyed, there is nothing between the US and China for an American response. Yeah, we might have been able to go up to Alaska, but that's still tremendous distance in trying to respond to China. So just look at the distance there. They show something over here that's interesting, the number of miles between Australia and the US, and look how the US looks in the Pacific. As big as the US is, the Pacific Ocean is so large. And the only thing between China and the US for naval forces is Pearl Harbor. December 7th, a day that will live in infamy. All of you have heard that before, I'm sure. The picture on the right shows where all of the US ships were, and it came from these two leaders. Yamamoto was the Japanese Marshal Admiral. He was the commander-in-chief. Nagumo was the field commander. He was on site for Pearl Harbor, as well as Midway. And Nagumo was in charge of all of the activities at Pearl Harbor. By the way, Yamamoto studied at Harvard, was a US naval attaché in the Japanese embassy in the US, spoke fluent English, was very, very knowledgeable about American values and American history. On the US side, we have Kimmel, Admiral Kimmel and Lieutenant General Short. Both of these men were a part of history. They were unfairly part of history because of America's poor communications, because of America's poor command. And both of them had great evidence of what they could or should do based on the information they had, but they didn't have it all correct. And the people above them did not provide them with adequate information. Kimmel never had any kind of real warning that attack was evident. Short thought that, there's so many Japanese on the island of Hawaii and sabotage is a possibility. I'm going to put all my planes together in the middle of the airfield. Guess what the hell happened with that? When the pilots came in from Japan and bombed all of the planes before any of them could get off the ground. So both of these gentlemen were part of what I call the sad history of World War II, and both were removed after Pearl Harbor. On site was a young man, kind of an eccentric guy called Joe Rochforth. He was an intelligence officer, and he had been trying like crazy to break the Japanese codes, the JN-25. And they didn't break it for Pearl Harbor. And therefore, they had no advance warning that anything was going to happen. In fact, if you've seen the movies or if you've read any of the books, minutes before the Japanese attacked, the American soldiers were raising the flags on the ships. Music was playing. They were cheering and they were having a good time, not aware of any of the attack coming through. I put Pearl Harbor combatants. That might be a little stretch. The Japanese had all the advantage because the Americans were not prepared for it. I'm not even sure combatants is the right word. The fighter planes were destroyed. The American fighter planes were destroyed when the Japanese flew in and just bombed and shot up the airfields. Any of the bombers were annihilated because they were all together. And the US did have anti-aircraft guns, but look at the number of torpedo planes and dive bombers and fighter planes and horizontal bombers. I mean, look at the ammunition that the Japanese had in this clandestine attack. Overwhelming. So what happened? Japan comes up with a 5-phase attack by the Japanese. This is noted by the US Navy, by the way. And these are the 5 phases that were going to take place. From 7:55 to 9:45, the devastation in that short period of time, 2 hours roughly, was enough to change America and change the world. You can see what happened and what they were trying to do. Here's a schematic, if you will, of the various attack points. And they were coming from the east, they were coming from the north, they were coming from the south, they were coming from all directions. And the Americans had very little to respond to except for some guns on some ships that may have knocked down 1 or 2 planes, but sure didn't do much in terms of protecting the battleships that were in the harbor. This is what the harbor looked like. The red markings are the ones that were sunk. The yellows were the ones that were destroyed. The blue ones were the destroyers. When you just take a quick look at that picture, not much was left. Not much was left. The only advantage was there were no aircraft carriers in Pearl. They were out in the Pacific. Here are some pictures of the devastation. I'm sure some of you have seen these before, but it's still shocking when you take a look at it. And you can see the aircraft bombers and the planes on the ground there on the top left. You can see the ships on the right. And I believe the lower left is the Arizona. I'm not positive of that, but I think it is. The devastation in Pearl looked like that in color. Nearly 3,000 military killed, plus hundreds injured in this battle. As I say, I'm not sure you call it a battle because we didn't have a chance to fight back very much. Here's Japan's mistakes. One was overt, the other one was not. Admiral Nagumo, the guy who was the commander in the field in the ocean, rejected a 3rd air raid strike on Pearl Harbor that would have crippled the harbor. And no one, I don't know the reason why for that. He just thought maybe they had done enough damage at this point and decided to back off. I have no idea what the reason was. But the other thing they did was they left the oil fields untouched. This was by design for the Japanese. Their thinking was they'll come back and have the fields available to them to support their fleet. What it did was allowed the American fleet to sustain itself and gather enough maintenance and new support to fight the Battle of Midway and other places. Had the Japanese destroyed the oil fields, it would have knocked the US out of the war for many, many years. Think about that. Lack of a 3rd attack and not bombing the oil fields. Here's a picture taken on site of the Arizona that was hit and sinking. Here's a picture of the Arizona going down with 1,100 servicemen on the ship and entombed in that particular ship. Here's the USS Arizona Memorial today, and you can see the ship underneath. There aren't too many of the soldiers who were on the Arizona alive today. Many of them, when they died, would have their ashes sent to Pearl, and divers would take the ashes down and put them in the Arizona. Okay, so the attack took place. Japanese returned. They're pretty giddy and excited. They're dominant. They control the Pacific. Before it started, Yamamoto told the Japanese, "I can only guarantee 6 months in the Pacific." And he said that in October, 2 months before he left. Here were his comments. Japan could not win a protracted war with the US. Pearl Harbor attack had become a blunder. Oil fields were not destroyed, and we did not get any aircraft carriers. Yamamoto alone, while he's alone, and his staff was celebrating, spent the day after Pearl Harbor sunk in an apparent depression. Here's the other thing. Japan didn't get the 3 aircraft carriers. But more than that, Yamamoto was upset by the bungling of the foreign ministry, which led to the attack happening while the US and Japan were technically at peace, thus making the incident an unprovoked sneak attack that would certainly enrage the enemy, the USA. His background, his knowledge of America, his language skills, his life in America told him that America would not wait to get into this war. And his final comment, that was his quote, "I fear all we have done at Pearl is to awaken a sleeping giant." The next day, Roosevelt addresses Congress with that great speech on the day of infamy. And in that, he was just very, I was going to play it for you, but it was just a little too long. But he was very, very aggressive and dominant in saying, "We are going to strike back, and we are going to strike back quickly." In the back, he doesn't have a whole lot of munitions. He doesn't have a whole lot of naval ships. He doesn't have a whole lot of Air Force. I mean, he doesn't have a whole lot, but his attitude was, "We're striking back." He personally selects, Admiral Nimitz. And over the next 6 months, Admiral Nimitz becomes totally engulfed and responsible for the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Seal, the Battle of the Coral Sea, and the Battle of Midway. Think about this, December 7. By April 18, Doolittle, who was a professor at MIT, working as, and also an aviation expert, was asked by the government, primarily by the president, to attack Tokyo. We didn't have planes that were big enough to fly that far and back, and we didn't have a way in which to make it happen. So they came up with a creative idea. Now, this is 128 days since Pearl. They want to strike back. They want to tell Japan, "We're not going to sit back." This was strictly Roosevelt. Most people thought he was crazy. He wanted to attack back. So they came up with this idea of a number of B-25s leaving the USS Hornet about 300 or 400 miles out from Japan, sneaking up on Japan, and then going in and bombing and turning around and then flying in China and landing there and having safety in China. What happened was they couldn't get to the 400 miles. And I'm not quite sure about that in miles. I think it was 400 or 500. But they were back about another 400 miles when they saw some Japanese fishing boats or some sort of ships. And they feared that word would get to Japan before we had the attack. So they left early, knowing they had limited fuel to get to Japan, let alone to get to China. Admiral Halsey was the commander of the ship, a very attack-oriented commander. What they did is they stripped down, by the way, no bomber had ever left an aircraft carrier. So what they had to do with these B-25s, in order to carry any bombs at all, is they had to strip it down to just about everything in this bloody plane. You read the accounts on what they had to take out, you wonder how the plane ever got off the ground. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle and the Doolittle Raiders, 80 of them, known as the Tokyo Raid. This was the first air attack against Japan in April of 1942. And that is an actual picture of that plane taking off, one of the planes taking off. They went to Japan and they bombed Japan. And the impact of Japan was, what the hell happened? It destroyed a bunch of homes and didn't have any impact on any manufacturing factories or any. It was a psychological blow to the Japanese that America had dropped bombs on Japan, which is exactly what President Roosevelt was looking for. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Cole died a couple of years ago. He was the last of the 80 Doolittle Raiders. When all the Raiders came back, the ones that did come back, because many of them fell into the ocean before getting to China. Many of them crashed in Japan and were kept in prisons and killed, tortured and killed. Some went to China and were protected by the locals. And many of them came back, and each year they would have a get-together. And they had a big jug of some drink, and they had all of the survivors' names. And each year they would salute the Raiders. And when each one would die, they would turn the cup down. And they said, when the last two Raiders come to the party, that will be the end of the Doolittle get-togethers. And Colonel Cole died on April 19th. The attack was considered a great success, a moral success, a psychological success. That's in April. A few weeks later, the US gets information that the Japanese are going to attack Port Moresby, down close to Australia. And they want to get in there to establish more runways, more opportunities for the Japanese to launch from further south in the Pacific to support their defensive position. The U.S. gets word of this, and they sent two of the aircraft carriers down there in their first contact, the USS Yorktown, USS Lexington. This was the Battle of the Coral Sea, but not important other than to know that it was near Australia, and they wanted to launch and go next to Australia, but launch from there, and also to protect New Guinea. Here's the USS Lexington, here's the USS Yorktown. This was the first battle fought entirely with aircraft carriers. And it was an enormous battle on both sides. The Battle of the Coral Sea. The US learned the Japanese was going to try and seize Moresby. The Japanese wanted to control the Coral Sea between Australia and New Caledonia. They wanted to develop an air base in Moresby. They wanted to develop an air base in Tulagi. The US sent Fletcher to intercept the landing group and to attack ships. In 42, Fletcher struck landings at Moresby, and in 4-5, aircraft carriers clashed. The US sank the Shoho and the cruiser. The Japanese sank the USS Lexington and severely damaged the USS Yorktown. The US damaged beyond repair the Shokaku and had to retire from service, and US damaged many Japanese planes. The battle caused a lack of air power for the invading forces, and the Japanese retreated to Rabaul. Here's the importance of that. This is the first time they retreated. And the US Yorktown had to cripple back to Pearl for some immediate repairs. Battle of the Coral Sea. Who won? the US and Japan suffered many losses. The USS Lexington explodes, and Yorktown goes back to Pearl. The analysis by the experts, and I'm not one of them, but by the experts, the Navy experts and other people who have done greater writings about the war in the Pacific, believe that a major strategic Allied victory occurred at the Battle of the Coral Sea. This was the first time in the Pacific War, only 4 or 5 months old, the Japanese withdrew without achieving their objective. In this case, the vital port Moresby in Papua New Guinea. So you're now into April, 4 months after Pearl Harbor, and you don't have many ships available to you except these 3 carriers, and you just lost one now. So we're down to 2 carriers. So here's the Japanese dilemma following the Battle of the Coral Sea. Should we go in and isolate Australia and continue to move south in the Pacific, or should we attack Midway as a sentry for Hawaii and protect the entire Pacific Ocean so that if the Allies, if US, wanted to try and leave from Hawaii, they would be in very, very deep trouble because they would have no place to stop. The decision was to attack Midway, and its code was AF. We'll get to that in a minute. Prior to Midway, here's what happened. The Doolittle raid on Japan promoted decision. They produced the major naval battle in the Coral Sea, and their idea was that victory at Midway would eliminate the US Pacific Fleet once and for all. And this would lead to a negotiated peace, which was the exit strategy of Yamamoto from the beginning. He could not get into a prolonged war with the US. Events leading up to the Battle of Midway. Once again, Pearl on December 7th. Nimitz comes in on the 31st. The Doolittle raids in April. In April and May, you had the Battle of the Coral Sea in May. But in April and May, the US intelligence, Roquefort, breaks the JN code. And from June 4 to June 7, we have the Battle of Midway. So let's see what that looks like. Roquefort broke the code, but he wasn't convinced that he had proof. He sensed that there was going to be an attack, another Japanese attack. And what he wanted to find out was, and he suspected it was Midway, but what he wanted to find out was, is that confirmed? And so he sent a fake message that he knew the Japanese would pick up. And the fake message said that the water distillation plant at Midway was seriously damaged. Roquefort picked up the US intercept after the Japanese communicated back and forth that said, AF is short of water. That meant the Americans knew that the Japanese were going to attack Midway. So that was confirmation that Midway was the target. However, we had an internal battle going on between California and particularly Washington, D.C. The intelligence officers in Washington, D.C. thought Roquefort was a nut. And the people in West Coast did not and were not convinced that what Roquefort was telling Nimitz was sufficient enough for any kind of change. But to Nimitz's credit, he supports Roquefort, and he sets up with his minimal force, he sets up an elaborate decoy plan near Midway. Think about that. From Pearl to Midway is about 1,300 miles. So if that's 1,300 miles, look at the distance you're talking about over to China, and we can't even put a map over there to the US. Large, large distances. But at Midway, this little tiny atoll was going to be a stopping point for the Japanese, and they were going to then go into Pearl and destroy Pearl. Here was Yamamoto's vision for the attack. He wants to get a negotiated peace. In the control of the Pacific, an all-out naval battle, he has to have success at Midway. America would seek peace. It's a complex plan, many diversionary tactics. 4 of 8 aircraft carriers would be in the vicinity of Midway. He would invade Midway, use the airfields 1,300 miles to Oahu. Invade Oahu, use oil for fuel, and command the Pacific. Fleet would include the largest battleship in the world called the Yamamoto, and he'd have these other ships with him. Here's the major flaws at the time. Unknown, of course, but at the time. He less so than most of the Japanese leaders believed in the supremacy of the battleship. The aircraft carrier is to support the battleship. And this was a new time in war when the aircraft carrier became the dominant naval piece of equipment. And the Japanese didn't quite get that as much as they could have. And they underestimated the US naval strength because when Yorktown went back, Nimitz said that it had to be repaired within 2 or 3 days and get out to sea again. And they said it was impossible. But what happened was they got the entire workforce working 24 hours a day, and they got it repaired to the point where the Yorktown could be part of the battle. And most importantly, the US codebreakers were able to determine the time and place of the Battle of Midway. So this time the US has the advantage of knowing when and where. The obvious commander in charge for the Battle of Midway was going to be Bill Halsey. He was the one on the, what was the name of the ship? He was the one on the ship at the Doolittle raid, and the name will come back to me. But Halsey is hospitalized with dermatitis, and he recommends Spruance to lead the fleet, which I think was divine intervention, and you'll see why in a minute. Halsey was a Patton of the water. He was going to attack at all costs, never take a step back. And in this particular battle, the nuances of being defensive rather than offensive were much greater for the Americans. Fletcher was going to be the senior commander, but Spruance was going to be the fleet commander in the field. The US carriers, okay, it was the Hornet that I was talking about that Halsey was part of before. The Hornet was going to be captained by Mason. USS Enterprise would be Spruance. The Yorktown would be Fletcher. And all of these 3 were going out to sea and to the east of Midway, far outside of the range for upcoming aircraft carriers to get to them and for them to return. I don't know that I could describe this to you. I'm not sure I understand it, except it's a map that shows the various forces that the Japanese were going to use, where they were going to use them, where they were going to have decoys, and everything was going to the big yellow dot, right, the blue dot right here, which was Midway, and there's Oahu over here. And the Pacific Fleet was out to the east, and the strike force was going further to the east, so that these planes in here would have too far to go to get them and get back. The invading forces, you can take a look at what we have here. And it looks almost like the Japanese have a much greater advantage, both in terms of carriers and aircraft carriers, float planes, everything seems a little more. But the advantage that US had was that we were able to know when and where everything was going to take place. Another one of these maps that the Battle of Midway and the approach, I put in here just to show you that this was the game plan by the Japanese. And here again is, if I can find this, here's Pearl and Oahu over here. And here's Spruance, here's Midway. Spruance is over here, Fletcher is over here, okay? So they're going to keep moving out unless they see some sort of advantage when Nagumo comes in. And here's Midway right here. Okay. June 4, battle begins. In this battle, because the ships of the aircraft carriers are so far apart, they have to send out these PBY planes, which are basically planes to search the enemy. Where are they? Pacific Ocean's pretty damn big. So they set out PBYs and PBYs, and the Japanese did the same thing because the Japanese didn't know exactly what was happening. These are some of the pilots and crew members who discovered the fleets, okay? But there were many, many others who went out and couldn't find anything and had to go back and get refueled, get ready for another battle. This was the U.S. aircraft carrier with torpedo aircraft. This was a comment, and these are real life battle pictures. This is a comment by Lieutenant Commander Waldron. My greatest hope is that we encounter a favorable tactical situation, but if we don't, I want each of us to do our utmost to destroy the enemies. If there is only one plane to make the final run in, I want that man to go in and get a hit. And may God be with us. Wow, pretty amazing. That was the mentality of the soldiers, because there was a great deal of anger over what happened in Pearl. I can't understate that. America was in a very, very ugly mood to get some retribution against Japan. The Battle of Midway lasted 5 minutes. They struggled to find the various carriers. They finally found them, and then some didn't succeed. And near the end of the battle, you had two individuals who commanded a great deal of activity. McCluskey was from the Enterprise, and he led the sinking of 2 Japanese ships, the Kaga and the Akagi. With his fuel running low, he located the enemies and direct dive bombers into an attack, and he lost over half of his aircraft to fuel starvation. What they did was they followed Commander Walden's request. If there's only one plane, make a run. If there are more planes and you don't have the fuel, go in. Leslie came from Yorktown, and he took off 1 hour earlier, and he sighted the Japanese carriers. His group arrived the same moment as McCloskey's, and he attacked and sunk the Soryu. So in 5 minutes, these 2 carriers are destroyed. Leslie gets a Navy Cross. McCluskey gets a Navy Cross. The Japanese carriers lost at the Battle of Midway were the Akagi and the Soryu and the Kaga. The Hiryu was crippled. What happened following that is the planes from the Hiryu found the Yorktown, and it says it sunk it, but what it did, it damaged it to where it was stuck in the water, and the next day the U.S. destroyed it. Admiral Nagumo, the field commander, fleet commander, his flagship was the Akagi. It was destroyed, so he vacates to another ship. With 3 carriers out of action, Yamamoto takes over control from the battleship Yamato, which is still further to the west. And the Hiryu pilots take care of the Yorktown, and Yamamoto tries to draw out Spruance toward Alaska to still seize the victory. Here's where I said the defensive position is so important. Spruance doesn't bite, and he retreats. Yamamoto declares all fleets retreat to Japan. The battle is over. Think about this. From December 7th, the day of infamy, to June 7th is 6 months. The Americans were totally at a disadvantage, both in Pearl, in equipment, and machinery. The will to go and drop bombs on Tokyo in the way in which they did it, and how so many died doing it. The will to go fight, protect Australia with the 2 aircraft carriers. And the return to Midway, repairing that one ship and getting it ready to participate in the battle, and the strategy to defend rather than attack caused the Battle of Midway to end. And in 6 months, America had control of half of the Pacific Ocean again. Military losses, you can see the difference. The Japanese, particularly with the 4 carriers, was absolutely destroyed when they went back. Major factors involved in our winning the Battle of Midway. Japanese didn't destroy the oil fields. We'd broken the IJN code, JN25. They believe that because of that, they were able to take the limited resources that we had and use them to great advantage. Admiral Nimitz had the guts to support Roquefort when nobody believed him that AF was Midway. The IJN, the Japanese, had a bad case of victory disease, having swept them from Pearl through the Dutch Indies and the Indian Ocean without losing a major vessel. Well, they lost a few here. The Japanese not getting their submarine line in place until 1 June after the US carriers had crossed that line. They could have used submarines in a better way, basically what they were saying there. And McCluskey and his other compatriots' decision to search beyond the rational range of his aircraft and thus finding the carriers with their aircraft on deck, fully fueled and armed. And this was a crisis that Nagumo caused because he kept changing between the planes having torpedoes and then just shooting equipment. I'm not sure that's proper words, but that's the idea. And by the time they changed, their planes were on deck, fueled and armed, and we went in there and bombed them in that 5-minute time frame and destroyed them. He lost over half of his aircraft due to fuel starvation. That was McCluskey. Nothing can be said more than the bravery of the American pilots, sailors, soldiers, and Marines. And nothing can be said more that Spruance was in command rather than Halsey, because it's everyone's belief in the military, not Frank's, but the military, that Halsey probably would have attacked and could have been destroyed. And what Spruance did by backing away and going into a defensive shell was probably one of the reasons that the Allies saved 2 aircraft carriers. After Midway, the Japanese were on the defensive in the Pacific. And these were some of the other battles that were taking place. There was great loss of life from great American heroes who turned the tide to victory. We remember them today. What battle turned the tide of World War II in the Pacific? Well, all the experts say it was the Battle of Midway. I happen to agree, just as a novice historian, because when you look at the map, just as a average person, and you say, here's your naval force, and if that naval area called Oahu and Pearl Harbor is destroyed, and you have no place to put your naval ships, how could you fight the Japanese anyplace else in the Pacific? The U.S. decision in the air-sea battle on June 3 to 6, and its defense of the major base located in Midway dashed Japan's hopes of neutralizing the U.S. as a power and effectively turning the tide of World War II in the Pacific. What it did is it mainly defeated the strategy that the Japanese had of getting the U.S. to come to the table and negotiate after Pearl and Midway would be destroyed. They wanted to negotiate a settlement. As Yamamoto said from the beginning in October of 41, we only have 6 months. If we can't stop the U.S. in 6 months, we have no hopes of doing that. So let's have a complete victory out there and let's bring them to the negotiating table. Here's the memorial in Washington, D.C. They had no right to win. Yet they did. And in doing so, they changed the course of a war, even against the greatest of odds. There is something in the human spirit, a magic blend of skill, faith, and valor that can lift men from certain defeat to incredible victory. World War II deaths in the Pacific theater came to about 277,000 deaths and missing and wounded. We remember all of them today and those who followed. Here's another little story that you may not have known about. I asked the question 3 or 4 times already tonight. Here's a good picture. What would have happened if Midway was lost? What would the Japanese have done? Would they have gone and taken Australia? They certainly took the Philippines. Then what would they have done? How could the US Navy get back to trying to protect and clear the Philippines and support Australia? I don't have an answer for you. It seems obvious to me that winning that battle was a critical part of winning the war in the Pacific. Here's something else. Oh, looks like it's distorted a little bit. The date, April 18, 1943. On this date, 4 days earlier, the U.S. Naval Intelligence, Roosevelt and his team, decrypted a message containing specifics of Yamamoto's tour, including the arrival and departure times and locations, as well as the number of types of aircraft that would transport and accompany him on the journey. Yamamoto, the itinerary revealed, would be flying from Rabaul to Balele Airfield on an island near Bougainville in the Solomon Islands on the morning of April 18, 1943. So the code breakers who saved Midway are now going to get the man who designed, controlled, and led the attack on Pearl Harbor and on Midway, Yamamoto. Death by P-38s when America killed Japan's top admiral, Isoroku Yamamoto, on April 18, 1943. Later, months later, a couple years later, the US and its allies succeeded in ending Japanese control of the Pacific. And on September 2, 1945, the fall of the Empire of Japan on the Battleship Missouri took place in Tokyo Bay. And VJ Day took place. I want to thank you for allowing me to share this story with you tonight. I'm just so grateful that I was asked and so grateful to share it with all of you. I would also like to thank you and all of our servicemen and women who protect our country each and every day, those who have passed us and those who are working for us today. So thank you very much. I'll be happy to answer any questions if there are any. So I'll hold on and see if we have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frank. We did have one question come in. I can read it for you. It says, is there any accuracy that FDR wanted the attack to take place to get American citizens to allow the U.S. to get involved in the war?
Do the people hearing this hear that question, or do I need to repeat it?
They should be able to hear the question. Yep.
Okay. So everybody has the question. I will tell you that, but for about 10 years, I tried following that question. I probably have 10 books. I probably have read and studied. And I believe I've come to the conclusion, as well as most people, that he didn't know exactly what was going to happen. I believe he felt like Japan was going to attack, but he didn't know exactly where, and he didn't know when it was going to happen. And the problem that I said that history fell down upon Kimmel and my Air Force Lieutenant Colonel, I can't think of his name, Lieutenant General is that they didn't have any advanced knowledge of what was going on, and there was lack of communication by him, by the chief, the staff in Washington, D.C. The intelligence community didn't have anything good for them to know anything was going on. But the question very specifically, did Roosevelt have any pre-knowledge of this attack on Pearl Harbor to want it so that he could get into the war? Because there's a lot of discussion, and has been from day one after the attack. And my conclusion is no. And I say that because I went into it believing that maybe there was, because I really felt that Kimmel and the Lieutenant General were mistreated. But they had to, they were on site when it happened, so they had to let those two leaders go. They had to bring in new people. I understand that. But what I would have hoped was that later years, they would have been able to get some sort of acknowledgement that, in fact, they didn't have any idea of what was going to happen, and therefore should have been treated a lot better than they were, because they were really attacked by the U.S. Navy after that. So no, I don't think that happened.
Thank you so much. Well, Frank, it looks like those are all the questions for this evening. So once again, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your wisdom and knowledge. And again, thank you to all the veterans and the families of the veterans that have served and protected our country. So have a great night, everyone.
Thank you all.